Are Filipinos really Southeast Asian? What DNA reveals. DNA. The results were unexpected. In 2021, scientists discovered something extraordinary buried inside the DNA of a small group of people living in the mountains of the Philippines. They found that one indigenous community here carries more DNA from an extinct human species than any other population ever studied on Earth. Not in Europe, not in the Americas, here, in the Philippines. So the question isn't really whether Filipinos are Southeast Asian. The question is what almost nobody tells you. Filipino DNA tells a story far older, far stranger, and far more layered than any single label like Southeast Asian can actually hold. Let's start with the obvious answer. Because on paper, geographically, culturally, historically, yes, the Philippines is Southeast Asian. It sits in the region. It shares trade history, colonial history, and cultural exchange with its neighbors, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand, Brunei, Singapore. Ask any geography teacher, and they'll draw a line around the map and say, this is Southeast Asia, and the Philippines sits comfortably inside it. That's not wrong. But genetics tells a much deeper and more complicated story than a line on a map ever could. And that story starts not thousands of years ago, but tens of thousands of years ago, long before anyone had a word for Southeast Asia at all. To really understand what Filipino DNA reveals, we need to walk through this in layers, because that's exactly how geneticists themselves describe it. Human ancestry, in any population, isn't one clean story. It's more like sediment, layer stacked on layer, each one deposited by a different wave of migration, trade, or conquest, and each one still readable today if you know how to look for it in the genome. The first and oldest layer takes us back further than almost anyone expects. Long before anyone spoke a Southeast Asian language, long before rice farming, long before any of the migrations we usually associate with the region, the islands that would become the Philippines were already inhabited. The people who arrived first are believed to have reached these islands as part of one of the earliest waves of modern human migration out of Africa, moving along the coastlines of Asia tens of thousands of years ago, following what researchers often call the southern coastal route, hugging the shorelines of South Asia and Southeast Asia, island hopping across land bridges and narrow sea crossings that existed during periods of lower sea levels in the Ice Age. Their descendants are still here today. We call them Negrito populations. Groups like the Aita, the Agta, the Ati, the Mamanwa, communities with dark skin, tightly curled hair, and some of the oldest continuous genetic lineages found anywhere outside of Africa. These are not, as colonial-era anthropologists once crudely suggested, primitive remnants stuck in time. They are living representatives of one of the deepest branches of the human family tree found anywhere in Asia, populations whose ancestors arrived on these islands so long ago that entire other human species, cousins of ours, were apparently still walking the earth alongside them. For a long time, mainstream history treated these communities as a footnote, small, marginalized groups living in the mountains and forests, overshadowed by the majority population's story, mentioned briefly in textbooks before moving quickly onto more familiar chapters about Malay migration, Spanish colonization, and independence. But genetics flipped that narrative upside down, and it did so in a way that stunned even the researchers involved. In 2021, a landmark study led by researchers examining Itamagbukon DNA, found that this community carries the highest level of Denisovan ancestry of any population ever measured, anywhere in the world. Higher, notably, than populations in Papua New Guinea and parts of Melanesia, regions that had previously held the record for highest known Denisovan ancestry. Denisovans were a mysterious, archaic human species, cousins of the Neanderthals, known mostly from a handful of bone and tooth fragments found in a Siberian cave called Denisova Cave, along with some additional fossil evidence later identified on the Tibetan Plateau. We know almost nothing about what Denisovans looked like. We have no complete skeleton. What we know about them comes almost entirely from DNA, fragments of genetic code extracted from ancient bones, and increasingly from the DNA of living humans who carry pieces of their genome today. And yet here, in the Philippines, in a community many people outside the country have never even heard of, their genetic fingerprint survived more strongly than almost anywhere else on the planet. Let that sink in for a moment. The deepest, oldest layer of Filipino ancestry isn't simply Southeast Asian in the way we casually use that term today. It's older than the region's modern identity. It connects the Philippines to a story of human migration and interbreeding with archaic species that predates farming, predates most languages spoken in the region today, predates almost every civilization we typically learn about in history class. It connects a small mountain community in the Philippines to a story that stretches back to a cave in Siberia, to a vanished branch of humanity that split off from our shared ancestors hundreds of thousands of years ago, wandered across Asia, and then, at some point, met and mixed with the ancestors of the people who would eventually settle these islands. Scientists still don't fully understand why Denisovan ancestry appears so strongly concentrated in this particular region, stretching from the Philippines through parts of Melanesia and into Australia and Papua New Guinea, while remaining far lower or nearly absent in populations elsewhere in Asia. One leading theory suggests that early modern humans encountered and interbred with Denisovan populations somewhere in this broader region, possibly multiple times, in multiple locations, as different waves of humans moved through Southeast Asia and into the Pacific over tens of thousands of years. Some researchers have even proposed that there may have been more than one distinct Denisovan population, genetically different from each other, encountered by different groups of early modern humans at different points in their migration. The genetic data is still being unpacked, and new studies continue to refine and sometimes complicate the picture. But regardless of the exact mechanism, the conclusion stands. Before there was any concept of Southeast Asia as a cultural or political region, before rice paddies, before trade ships, before kingdoms, there were already people here, and their descendants carry a connection to a lost chapter of human history that very few places on Earth can claim as strongly. That's the first layer. But it's only the first. Around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, a second major wave of migration reshaped the genetic map of the islands entirely. This was the Austronesian expansion, one of the most remarkable human migrations in history, and honestly, one of the most underappreciated in most popular accounts of world history. It began, according to the strongest genetic and linguistic evidence available today, in Taiwan, home to indigenous peoples whose languages form the root of the entire Austronesian language family, a family that today stretches from Madagascar off the coast of Africa all the way to Easter Island in the Pacific and everywhere in between: Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, much of Oceania, including Hawaii, New Zealand, and countless smaller Pacific island nations. Think about the scale of that for a moment. A language family, and the people who carried it, spanning more than half the planet's circumference, from the coast of East Africa to the far reaches of the Pacific Ocean, all traceable back to a starting point in Taiwan roughly 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. It's considered one of the most geographically expansive pre-modern human migrations ever documented, rivaling or in some ways exceeding the more commonly discussed migrations of Indo-European speakers across Europe and Asia, yet it receives a tiny fraction of the attention in mainstream history education. These Austronesian-speaking farmers and seafarers island-hopped southward from Taiwan, arriving first in the northern Philippines, likely around 4,000 years ago, then spreading gradually throughout the archipelago, before continuing onward into Indonesia, into the Pacific, eventually reaching as far as Hawaii, New Zealand, and Madagascar over the following millennia. They brought with them rice agriculture, sophisticated outrigger canoe technology that allowed them to navigate open ocean voyages, domesticated animals like pigs and chickens, and a language family that would eventually diversify into hundreds of distinct languages across the region, including Tagalog, Cebuano, Ilocano, and the dozens of other languages spoken across the Philippines today. When they arrived in the Philippines, they didn't erase the populations already living there. This is an important point, because older, cruder models of migration sometimes assumed that new arrivals simply replaced existing populations, wiping them out or pushing them entirely aside. Genetic studies show something more nuanced, a layering, an admixture, Austronesian ancestry blending with the deep indigenous lineages of Negrito populations who had already called these islands home for tens of thousands of years. In some regions, this blending was extensive, and in others, particularly in isolated mountain communities, indigenous populations remained more genetically distinct, preserving more of that ancient pre-Austronesian ancestry, which is precisely why groups like the Aita today carry such remarkably high levels of that deep, archaic genetic signal. This is where most Filipinos today draw the majority of their genetic ancestry. If you look at broad genetic surveys of the Philippine population, the dominant signal is this Austronesian component, closely related to populations in Taiwan's indigenous groups and shared substantially with people across Indonesia and Malaysia. This is the genetic backbone that ties the Philippines most directly and most measurably to the wider Southeast Asian and Pacific world. When researchers compare the genomes of Filipinos to other populations across the region, this Austronesian, Taiwan-linked signal consistently emerges as the strongest and most widespread thread running through the population. So far, this actually supports the Southeast Asian label pretty strongly, right? A deep indigenous layer, followed by a major Austronesian migration shared with neighboring island nations. That is, genetically speaking, about as Southeast Asian and Pacific connected as a population can get. If the story ended here, there would be very little to debate. Filipinos would simply be, genetically and culturally, part of a broad Austronesian-speaking family that happens to include Indonesians, Malaysians, and Pacific Islanders, all sharing a common migratory origin traceable back to Taiwan. But the story doesn't stop there, because for the next several thousand years, the Philippines sat at the center of one of the busiest maritime trade networks in the ancient and medieval world, and that traffic left genetic fingerprints too, layered on top of the Austronesian foundation, complicating the picture in ways that are only now being fully mapped out by modern genetic research. Long before European contact, the islands were trading with merchants from China, exchanging porcelain, silk, and goods for gold, pearls, and forest products. Chinese trade records dating back over 1,000 years describe organized settlements across the archipelago engaged in structured commerce. This wasn't occasional opportunistic contact. It was sustained, generational trade, the kind of relationship that inevitably leads to intermarriage, settlement, and genetic exchange over time. Genetic studies show measurable South Asian ancestry in parts of the Philippine population as well, believed to reflect ancient trade and migration links connecting South Asia to Southeast Asia over the centuries. Part of a broader pattern of Indian cultural and genetic influence that shaped much of the region, visible even today in loanwords found in Filipino languages, and in early political structures that borrowed concepts like the title Raja from Sanskrit, along with numerous other Sanskrit-derived words still used in Tagalog and other Philippine languages today. Words related to governance, religion, and even everyday concepts.
If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to subscribe, like and share this video, and leave a comment below. Thank you for watching.